My name is Isolde Maren, and I am 72 years old. People have called me practical stubborn kind to a fault, words that feel stitched into me like the seams of the clothes I once mended for a living. This morning, as I button my wool coat and tie my scarf, I realize my hands still remember how to fix what's torn. The trouble is, not everything torn wants to be mended. The kitchen smells faintly of nutmeg and sugar scents I once trusted to mean safety. For nearly 3 decades, I worked 2 jobs in Portland textiles, by day office cleaning, before dawn. My daughter Marielle and I shared a narrow apartment on Munjoy Hill, its windows forever fogged by steam from boiling potatoes. Every Thanksgiving, I turned that little space into a feast. I roasted a chicken instead of a turkey and sang to the radio while mixing pumpkin pie from scratch. Marielle would sit on the counter, her small heels knocking against the cupboard doors. "It smells like magic, Mama," she'd say, eyes wide, waiting for me to let her lick the spoon. Those were the years when warmth felt easy, as if it rose naturally from the oven, from her laughter, from the sound of the wind pushing against our thin window glass. Even when my knees ached from double shifts, I believed that love was enough to make the world steady. Now the oven behind me is cold. The cranberry sauce I made yesterday gleams in a glass jar wrapped with a towel so it won't crack on the ride. I am going to Marielle's new house in Cape Elizabeth, her first time hosting Thanksgiving. She asked me to bring the sauce like the old days, she said, and I heard something careful in her voice, as if nostalgia had become a language we no longer spoke fluently. Outside, the sky is pearl gray, the kind that promises snow by nightfall. I lock the door of my quiet apartment and glance once more at the tidy kitchen, at the chair across the table, where no one sits anymore. The warmth I built still lingers in the walls, faint but loyal, as I step out to deliver it to a place that no longer feels like mine. The road to Cape Elizabeth curved along the frozen shoreline, the sea a dull sheet of pewter under the winter light. By the time I reached Marielle's neighborhood, the air smelled of pine and chimney smoke. Her house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, white siding, navy shutters, and a porch wrapped in golden wreaths. It looked like a postcard, the kind that used to hang in bank lobbies during the holidays. Marielle opened the door before I knocked. Her hair was swept up neatly, her smile bright but careful. "You made it, Mom," she said, brushing a quick kiss against my cheek. Behind her, I caught glimpses of guests, Grant's co-workers, his parents, everyone already holding a drink. The house hummed with laughter and the clinking of glass. I handed her the jar wrapped in its towel. Cranberry sauce, the way we used to make it. "Oh, perfect," she said lightly, though her eyes flicked toward the crowded kitchen. "I'll just put it with the other dishes." I watched as she placed it near the sink, away from the polished silver trays lined with catered sides. The dining room shimmered with soft gold light. The table stretched nearly the length of my old apartment set, with 12 chairs and a centerpiece of roses and eucalyptus. The cutlery gleamed, each glass catching the chandelier's glow. I ran a hand over the back of my chair, its wood smooth and cold beneath my fingers. Grant moved easily among the guests, pouring imported wine and laughing in that confident way men learn when life has been kind. His mother Celestine sat at the head of the table, pearls bright against her dark sweater. She had the kind of grace that filled silence without effort. When she spoke, people leaned closer as though hearing something worth keeping. Marielle sat beside her, her gestures small and polished. I sat opposite near the end, close enough to hear, but never quite part of the rhythm. The scent of rosemary and butter drifted across the table, while conversation leapt from promotions to ski trips. My hands rested in my lap. Each laugh, each shared glance passed over me like light through glass. The cranberry sauce stayed by the sink untouched. Dinner began with the rustle of napkins and a burst of polite laughter. Candles glowed in crystal holders, their light trembling against polished plates. I folded my hands in my lap as Marielle disappeared into the kitchen and returned with the turkey. It was golden and perfect steam rising in delicate ribbons. The room went still for a moment, admiration soft as applause. Marielle beamed. "It came out better than I hoped," she said, glancing toward Celestine. Celestine's smile was warm, practiced. "It's beautiful, darling. You've done such a lovely job." Marielle lifted the carving knife, her cheeks flushed. "Then this first slice," she said, voice bright with pride, "is for you, Celestine. You deserve the best cut." The knife slid through the meat cleanly, the blade catching the light as she laid a thick, glistening piece onto Celestine's plate. Celestine touched her arm, a gesture of approval that carried weight, and the conversation swelled again, easy and flowing. Marielle carved another generous portion for Grant, then one for his father, then for a few of the friends who had joined. Each plate left her hands perfectly arranged, draped in herbs and shining with glaze. The table filled with color cranberry reds, pumpkin golds, the soft ivory of mashed potatoes. I waited quietly, the hum of voices and clinking glass wrapping around me like a soundproof curtain. When at last she turned my way, her rhythm barely faltered. She sliced along the edge near the bone, the knife scraping faintly as it caught a joint. What fell onto my plate were uneven scraps, dry ends curling slightly from the heat. She didn't look up as she passed it down, already laughing at something Celestine said. The sound of the knife against porcelain struck sharp in the air, a note only I seemed to hear. For a heartbeat, the room dimmed. I looked down at the fragments of meat and forced my smile to return gentle and steady. I adjusted my napkin, lifted my fork, and tasted nothing. The laughter rose again, bright and effortless, bouncing from one side of the table to the other. My daughter's voice blended with the rest, confident, assured, while mine stayed folded inside my chest, quiet as breath. I ate slowly, carefully, as if performing too. By the time I stepped outside, the night had turned to snow. It came down softly, catching in the light from the porch, before dissolving against my coat. The laughter from inside followed me to the gate, muffled by the door closing behind me. For a moment, I stood still, the cold biting at my throat. Then I began to walk. The street was quiet. The houses lined with soft yellow windows, families still gathered at their tables. My boots pressed into the snow with a faint crunch, leaving a trail that would vanish by morning. Each breath came out in a small white cloud, brief and uncertain. As I walked, memories rose like ghosts, keeping pace beside me. I saw myself standing at a pawn shop counter years ago, sliding my mother's gold necklace across the glass so Marielle could have her quinceañera dress, the pale blue one that made her look like the sea. I remembered taking on weekend shifts at the hospital, scrubbing floors long after midnight so her tuition check would clear. The smell of disinfectant had stayed on my hands for weeks. Later came the wedding, the gleam of chandeliers, and the hollow echo of a toast. I had borrowed against my small retirement plan for that celebration, telling myself it was worth it just to see her radiant. I believed that every sacrifice stacked neatly beneath the next, forming a staircase to her happiness. The snow thickened, softening the world until only my footsteps marked the difference between earth and air. The city lights blurred, haloed by the falling flakes. My fingers ached with cold, yet I didn't put them in my pockets. I wanted to feel something raw and real. I passed the bakery where we used to stop for leftover bread, at closing the bus stop, where we once waited for dawn together. Everything I had built for her, every hour, every ache, seemed to fold back into the snow. By the time I reached my street, my breath had steadied. The hurt was still there, but quieter now, reshaped into something I couldn't yet name. I opened my door and stepped inside, the silence of the apartment greeting me like an old companion. The morning light in the lawyer's office had been clear and cold, the kind that left no room for hesitation. I remember sitting across from a polished desk, my gloves folded neatly beside a stack of papers. The attorney, a quiet man named Mr. Kearns, explained everything twice, as if waiting for me to falter. I didn't. The sale of my old house had gone through the week before. The little clapboard place on Munjoy Hill, where Mariel took her first steps, was now in the hands of a young couple expecting their first child. I had packed the last box myself and left a small note in the kitchen drawer that simply said, "May this home be kind to you." Mr. Kearns slid the final document toward me. "The funds will transfer into your donor-advised account by the end of the week," he said. "Would you like to designate your daughter as a successor on the account?" I looked down at the empty line waiting for her name. The pen felt heavy between my fingers, not from doubt but from clarity. "No need," I said softly. "This isn't hers to carry." He nodded once and passed me another form details about the foundation that would receive the grants. It was a modest program through the Portland Community Fund created for older women starting again after divorce widowhood or long years of caring for others. I had asked that the first award go to someone who wanted to learn a new skill, maybe bookkeeping or floral design. Something that could rebuild a life. When I signed my name, the paper barely rustled. My handwriting looked steadier than it had in years. It felt like closing a door I'd once left open for too long. The pen left a small dot of ink at the end of my signature, a period where there had always been an ellipsis. As I walked out into the winter air, the wind off the bay cut through my coat, sharp and honest. It felt like the beginning of something that didn't need permission. 3 days after Thanksgiving, the air had turned sharp enough to sting the skin. I wrapped the serving dish in a towel and carried it to Marielle's house, the same one where laughter had floated so easily without me. The driveway was still lined with pale leaves, half buried under frost. A wreath of cranberries and twine hung on the door. I hadn't planned on staying long. I only wanted to return what was hers to close the small loop that still connected us. I knocked gently, expecting Marielle to answer. Instead, the door opened to Celestine. She stood there in a soft wool sweater, pearls at her throat, her poise untouched by the cold. "Oh," she said pleasantly, her smile composed. "Isolde, how lovely of you to stop by. I just came to return this," I said, holding out the dish. "It belongs to Marielle." She took it with both hands, careful not to brush mine. "That's thoughtful of you. She's at work today, busy time of year, you know. I'll make sure she gets it." Behind her, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon and polished wood. The same chandelier I'd stared at through dinner cast its soft light across the hallway. Celestine shifted the dish against her hip. "We all want what's best for Marielle," she said, her voice low but certain. "She's finding her footing, and it's important she feels supported. You did so much for her, truly. But now she needs room to grow into her own life." I met her eyes. They were kind but distant, like someone closing a curtain gently, rather than slamming it. "So do I," said. For a moment, we simply stood there, the porch boards creaking beneath our shoes. A car passed on the street, and the sound of its tires on the damp pavement faded slowly. Celestine smiled again, polite and unreadable before stepping back. "Take care of yourself, Isolde," she said. "I intend to." I turned and walked down the path, the cold air filling my lungs until it steadied my heartbeat. The dish was gone, and with it, the last small reason to return. The wind off the ocean carried the faint scent of salt and pine, and I let it move through me until all that remained was quiet. The weeks that followed slipped by quietly, marked by early sunsets and the slow melt of snow along the curbs. I spent most evenings reading by the window, the radio murmuring soft jazz, while the city outside folded into winter. I thought little of Marielle, or at least I tried to. One Tuesday afternoon, the phone rang. The sound startled me. Few people called anymore. I let it ring once before lifting the receiver. Her voice came through, bright at first, too bright. "Hi, Mom." It had been weeks since Thanksgiving, yet she said it as though no time had passed. She spoke quickly about the weather, about how busy the holidays had been. Her words fluttered light but restless, and underneath them something trembled. Finally, the truth edged its way out. Grant's firm had downsized, she said. The new mortgage felt heavier than expected. "We might have to sell the house," she added, with a small laugh that broke halfway. "We'll figure something out, of course, but things are tight right now." I listened, tracing the edge of the table with my fingertip. The old reflex stirred the instinct to fix, to offer to reach for my purse, even over the phone. It rose like a familiar tide, but I stayed still. She hesitated, then softened her tone. "You always knew what to do, Mom. You always helped." I took a slow breath. "I'm not in a position to help, Marielle." The line went quiet. I could hear her breathing, shallow and uneven. Then came a small laugh, brittle and embarrassed. "Oh, of course, I didn't mean, I just thought, never mind. I could have filled the silence with comfort, could have reached for the words that used to make everything lighter. But I didn't." Some lessons are only learned in the space between sentences. "I hope things work out for you," I said. "Truly. Thanks," she whispered. The call ended with a soft click. For a long moment, I stood there with the receiver in my hand, the room filled with the faint hum of the disconnected line. When I set it down, the silence felt solid, almost alive. My chest ached, but not from regret. It was something closer to release, like air finally reaching the bottom of my lungs. I moved to Rockland at the edge of spring, when the harbor ice had just begun to break apart, and the gulls circled low over the docks. The drive took 2 hours, the road winding along the coast through small towns with white churches and faded storefronts. By the time I arrived, the sky had cleared to a pale blue that felt like forgiveness. The cottage I rented sat a short walk from the wharf, its shingles weathered gray by years of salt and wind. The air smelled of lavender from a patch by the steps, and of the sea, always the sea. The first night I unpacked slowly, just a few boxes, some dishes, and the framed photo of Marielle as a child, with chocolate frosting on her cheek. I placed it on the windowsill where the morning light would find it, but not linger too long. The next day, I walked to the community center. A hand-painted sign by the door read, "Art for Beginners, All Ages Welcome." Inside, the room buzzed with low chatter and the faint scent of turpentine. There were 6 women around my age, each standing before a blank canvas. Magda, tall and thin, with a pink scarf tied around her head, smiled first. "You new in town?" she asked. "Just arrived," I said. She nodded toward the empty easel beside her. "Good. We need fresh eyes." The instructor, a patient man with paint on his elbows, told us to start with the sea. I dipped my brush into blue and hesitated before touching the canvas. My hands trembled, then steadied. The first line was crooked, the second worse. But the color spread softly across the surface like memory finding form. Over the weeks, I grew used to the rhythm of those afternoons. We spilled coffee, forgot our brushes in the rinse water, and laughed at the uneven lines that somehow looked like waves anyway. Ruth, a retired teacher with kind eyes, brought scones every Thursday. Magda painted seagulls that always seemed to fly the wrong direction. We talked about gardens, old songs, recipes that no longer needed measuring. No one asked where I came from, and I never felt the need to explain. The ache I had carried for so long began to loosen like knots in a thread gently pulled apart. By the time summer reached the coast, I had learned how to breathe without waiting for anyone to notice. By the next Thanksgiving, the town had settled into my bones, the way salt settles into wood. The mornings were crisp and bright, the harbor calm beneath its thin veil of mist. I had volunteered to organize the community dinner that year, nothing grand, just a long table at the Rockland Community Hall and a handwritten sign by the door that said, "Everyone welcome." The hall smelled of roasting turkey and warm bread. Folding chairs scraped softly against the floor as people arrived with foil-covered dishes. There was Harold, who had lost his wife 2 winters ago and still wore his wedding ring. Nora, who ran the thrift store and brought apple pies no one could resist. And a quiet young man named Caleb, who said he just wanted company. We pushed tables together until there was no head, no end, only a circle of sorts. Someone carved the turkey. No one asked who should start. No one waited for ceremony. Pieces passed from hand to hand until every plate was full. The laughter was small at first, then grew weaving through the clatter of forks and the soft hum of an old record player in the corner. Candlelight flickered against faces lined by time and weather. Magda's scarf had been replaced by new hair silver at the roots. Ruth's scones disappeared within minutes, crumbs scattered like confetti across the tablecloth. The air carried a warmth that wasn't tied to any oven or memory, just the steady pulse of people choosing to be kind. When the meal was done, I carried a plate to the window and looked out toward the dark water. Somewhere beyond that horizon, in another town, Marielle would be sitting at her own table, polished and perfect. I hoped she was warm. I hoped she had learned what I had, that love could survive distance, but not invisibility. I whispered into the quiet room, love isn't leaving. It's knowing when to stop being invisible. The words felt light, like a truth that no longer needed to be defended. As the guests drifted out into the cold night, I gathered the candles and left one burning in the window. Its small flame shimmered against the glass, steady and unafraid, the last light of the evening holding a place for anyone who might still be looking for a seat.